The sun over Caracas does not rise so much as it bruises the sky, a deep and swollen purple that hangs over the valley like a warning. On the morning of April the 30th, 2019, Nicolás Maduro stood at the center of a fortress that was supposed to be impenetrable. To the outside world, and to the millions of citizens standing in lines for bread that would never arrive, he was the defiant successor to a revolution, a man who had stared down the greatest superpower on earth and remained standing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's history together. He appeared to be at the very peak of his executive control, surrounded by a Praetorian guard of intelligence officers and generals who had sworn their lives to the Bolivarian cause. However, the tragedy of power is that it is often most brittle when it looks most solid. While Maduro adjusted his sash and looked into the cameras to project an image of absolute stability, the very air inside the Miraflores Palace was vibrating with a frequency he could not yet hear. The hidden, terminal weakness of his regime was not found in the street protests or the international sanctions that had withered the national currency into worthless paper. The weakness was standing exactly 3 feet behind him. It was a man who knew the rhythm of the president's heartbeat, the location of his bunkers, and the names of the shadows who moved his money. The world saw a dictator in control of a nation, but the truth was that the nation had already been sold from the inside out by the one person tasked with its protection. This was the beginning of a foreclosure, disguised as a revolution. For years, the Director General of the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, Manuel Cristopher Figuera, had been the shield of the state. He was the man who oversaw the dark hallways of the helicoid, the spiral-shaped prison where the enemies of the revolution were broken. He was the protector, the one who ensured that no whisper of dissent reached the presidential ears without a heavy price being paid. But the Americans had not come with soldiers or ships to take the country. They had come with a ledger. They had identified that the protector of the state was the very man who could liquidate it. The betrayal was not a sudden act of conscience, but a calculated predatory maneuver. Washington did not want to save Venezuela. They wanted to foreclose on a bad debt, and Figuera was the agent of that repossession. He was fed promises of a new life, a clean slate, and the preservation of his own power in a post-Maduro world. He was told he was a hero, a savior of the people, but in the cold light of the Situation Rooms in Virginia, he was simply the key that would turn the lock of the Venezuelan vault. The crisis did not begin with a slow burn. It exploded in the middle of a high-stakes gamble that was already failing. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the streets around the Carlota Air Base were filled with the smell of burning rubber and the acrid sting of tear gas. This was the moment of the first desperation, a military uprising that was supposed to be the final blow to the regime. Juan Guaidó stood on an overpass, calling for the military to turn their guns away from the people and toward the palace. But as the sun climbed higher, the expected wave of defecting generals did not materialize. The high-stakes gamble had hit a wall of silence. The soldiers stood frozen, watching their commanders for a signal that never came. And then, the second crisis emerged from the wreckage of the first. As the coup faltered on the streets, an even more terrifying reality was unfolding inside the corridors of power. The betrayal was not just a military failure, it was a total intelligence collapse. Maduro realized, as he reached for his secure lines, that the men he trusted to intercept the coup were the ones who had orchestrated it. The bridge was burning at both ends, and the water below was filled with sharks. You can almost feel the weight of the moment in the sensory details of the room. The air conditioning in the presidential bunker hums with a low mechanical anxiety, struggling against the humid heat of a Caracas morning. There is the smell of scorched ozone from the radio equipment and the heavy, cloying scent of strong coffee that has sat too long in the pot. On the mahogany desk, a map of the city is spread out, its edges curling under the weight of gold paperweights that feel heavier than they should. The gold is not just a symbol. It is the literal lifeblood of the regime, bars of the metal being moved in the dead of night to pay for the loyalty of mercenaries and the silence of the hungry. When Maduro picks up a pen to sign the orders for the arrest of his own intelligence chief, the sound of the nib scratching against the thick, cream-colored paper sounds like a bone snapping in a quiet room. The ink is dark and permanent, a death warrant that is being signed even as the territory he claims to rule is being redrawn by invisible hands in a distant capital. The solution to the morning's violence was to crush the uprising with a show of force, but that victory created a new and more terrifying problem. As the tanks rolled into the streets to disperse the crowds, Maduro found himself trapped in a nested loop of paranoia. He had successfully cleared the overpass, but in doing so, he had confirmed that he could no longer trust the men who gave him his information. Every general who stayed loyal that morning now looked like a potential assassin who had simply lost his nerve. To survive the afternoon, he had to empower his Russian and Cuban advisors, handing over the keys to his digital infrastructure and his personal security to foreign powers. But this created a new loop. By inviting the wolf into the house to keep out the fox, he had surrendered his own sovereignty. He was no longer the leader of a sovereign nation. He was a tenant in his own palace, paying rent in the form of oil rights and gold reserves to the very people who were now recording his every word. The geopolitical shift was not a political transition. It was a theft of a nation's future that has sparked a firestorm of debate across the globe. From the cafes of Madrid to the boardrooms of New York, the question remains, was this an act of liberation or the most sophisticated heist in the history of the 21st century? One side argues that the Americans were merely supporting the democratic will of a broken people, while the other side screams that Washington was using a traitor to dismantle a sovereign state for its mineral wealth. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a calculated move to strip Venezuela of its agency by turning its own protectors against it. The fallout of this intelligence war has left a scar on the collective memory of the continent, proving that in the modern era, you do not need to win a war on the battlefield if you can simply buy the man who holds the map. As the morning of the 30th turned into the afternoon, the chaos at the airbase began to settle into a grim stalemate, but the true battle was being fought in the encrypted messages flying between Caracas and Washington. The traitor, Figuera, was watching his plan crumble. He had promised the Americans a bloodless transition, a surgical removal of the leadership that would leave the country intact. Instead, he had triggered a civil war within the state apparatus. The cliffhanger of the moment was not whether Maduro would fall, but who would be left to rule the ashes if he did. The loop had closed on the coup, but it had opened a much more dangerous one. The realization that the betrayal had gone deeper than anyone anticipated. As the sun began to set, the shadow of the protector fell across the palace one last time, not as a shield, but as a ghost. By the early evening of April the 30th, 2019, the smoke over the Francisco de Miranda Air Base had begun to settle, but the silence that followed was far more dangerous than the gunfire. To the world watching on television, it appeared that the socialist revolution had weathered yet another storm, a testament to the iron will of the leadership and the unbreakable bond between the palace and the barracks. Nicolás Maduro appeared on national television, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had just dismantled a conspiracy, mocking the Americans for their supposed incompetence. However, this image of absolute victory was the ultimate deception. The identity shock of the evening was not that the coup had failed, but that the regime had already been hollowed out from within. While the president stood before the cameras, he was blissfully unaware that the two most powerful pillars of his administration, the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, and the President of the Supreme Court, Michael Moreno, had spent the previous 72 hours in a state of predatory negotiation with the opposition and their handlers in Washington. The terminal weakness was not a lack of soldiers, but a total bankruptcy of loyalty at the very top. The men who had just stood beside him in a show of unity were the same men who had been reviewing drafts of a legal decree that would have stripped him of his office and sent him into exile. The betrayal of the protector took on a new and more sinister form as the night deepened. These were not men looking to save the democracy of their country. They were looking to liquidate a failing enterprise before the doors were locked forever. The negotiations were framed not as a pursuit of justice, but as a foreclosure. Michael Moreno, the man tasked with the legal integrity of the nation, had reportedly demanded a payment of $10 million and a guaranteed seat of power in the transition government. This was not the act of a patriot, but the act of a corporate raider looking to secure his own parachute while the employees were still fighting in the streets. The Americans, playing the role of the ultimate lender, were not offering charity to the Venezuelan people. They were facilitating the sale of a president by his own lieutenants. The protector had become the predator, and the price of the nation was being haggled over in encrypted chat rooms and hushed meetings in safe houses across the capital. The story does not pause to breathe after the failure of the uprising. Instead, it jumps directly into a second, more desperate crisis that was the direct result of the first. As the street protests dissolved, the second crisis began, the total disintegration of trust within the high command. Maduro knew someone had blinked, but he did not know who. The air in the Situation Room was thick with a new kind of terror. It was no longer about the crowds outside, it was about the man sitting across the table. Every general who had delayed his deployment, every judge who had been slow to issue a warrant, was now a suspect in a grander, more terrifying game. The failure of the coup did not bring peace. It brought a purge that began to consume the very brain of the state. The protector was no longer guarding the palace. He was hunting for the traitor among his own children, unaware that the betrayal had already reached its terminal phase in the form of a major general who was at that very moment heading for the border. The sensory details of this collapse are visceral and unrelenting. Imagine the fluorescent lights of the military intelligence headquarters flickering with a rhythmic, buzzing persistence that matches the throbbing headache of a man who has not slept in 48 hours. There is the smell of unwashed uniforms and the metallic tang of gunpowder that has been tracked into the hallways on the boots of the soldiers returning from the overpass. You can hear the rhythmic tapping of fingers on a desk, a sound that mimics the countdown of a bomb. In the corner of the office, a shredder whirs with a mechanical hunger, devouring lists of names and financial records that can never be seen by the public. The weight of the world is felt in the heavy, leaden slump of a general's shoulders as he realizes that the private jet he had arranged for his escape is still sitting on the tarmac, its engines cold, while the doors of the palace are being bolted shut by the very man he was supposed to replace. Every solution the regime found that night only opened a more dangerous loop of dependency and fear. To secure the loyalty of the remaining officers, Maduro was forced to grant them even greater control over the nation's dwindling food supply and its illegal gold mines. He solved the problem of a potential military revolt by turning his generals into a criminal cartel, but this created the loop of ultimate vulnerability. By giving them the keys to the treasury, he made them indispensable, but he also made them the primary targets of the next round of American sanctions. Every dollar he used to buy their silence was a dollar that could no longer be used to keep the lights on in the hospitals. The loop of survival was a loop of national suicide, where each act of preservation further eroded the foundation of the state until there was nothing left but a shell of authority held together by the threat of mutual destruction. The narrative of this failed transition has become the ultimate comment section bait, a flashpoint for intense debate over the nature of international intervention and the price of sovereignty. One faction argues that the $10 million demand by Moreno is proof that the entire Venezuelan leadership is a collection of mercenaries who would sell their mothers for a wire transfer. They claim that the Americans were right to try and buy the country back from a dictator. The opposing side fires back that this was a classic example of imperialist meddling, a predatory attempt to use high-level bribery to orchestrate a regime change that the people themselves had not asked for. The debate is not just about politics. It is about the soul of a nation, and whether it is possible to build a future on the foundation of a betrayal. It provokes a visceral reaction because it suggests that the fate of millions is often decided by the greed of a few men in a room, regardless of the ideologies they claim to represent. As the clock ticked toward midnight on May 1st, 2019, the intelligence chief, Manuel Cristopher Figuera, was no longer in the palace. He had become a ghost in the machine, moving through the shadows of the city toward the Colombian border. He carried with him the most dangerous weapon in the world, the truth of who had talked and what had been promised. The betrayal of the protector was complete, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. He had fed Washington every detail, every weakness, and every secret bank account, thinking he was buying his own freedom. But as he looked back at the lights of Caracas for the last time, he realized that he had not just sold Maduro, he had sold the map of the entire revolutionary project. The nested loop of his own survival now required him to become a permanent asset of the very power he had spent his life fighting. The final chapter of this long and shadowed history reached its climax not in a slow decline, but in a flash of blinding technological superiority and the ultimate failure of a fortress. For 7 years following the betrayal of Manuel Cristopher Figuera, Nicolás Maduro had lived as a man who believed he had beaten the odds. He had survived coups, sanctions, and isolation, and by the start of 2026, He projected the image of a leader who was untouchable behind the steel and concrete of his compound in Caracas. This was the ultimate identity shock. A man who felt he was at the absolute peak of his security, only to discover that his entire defensive grid had been converted into his own cage. On the morning of January the 3rd, 2026, the world woke to a paradox. The man who had mocked the Americans for years as a paper tiger was no longer in his palace. The hidden, terminal weakness was not found in his guards, but in the very infrastructure of the city he ruled. The Americans did not need to fight their way through the streets. They simply turned off the lights of a nation and reached through the darkness to take what they wanted. The betrayal of the protector reached its predatory zenith during Operation Absolute Resolve. For years, the intelligence gathered from Figuera and other defectors had been used to build a perfect digital and physical replica of the presidential life. This was not a rescue mission for democracy. It was a high-precision foreclosure on a human target. The Americans had waited for the perfect atmospheric conditions, 4 days of heavy cloud cover that acted as a natural shroud for their approach. The betrayal was found in the silence of the radar and the total collapse of the early warning systems that were supposed to protect the sovereign leader. When the power grid in Caracas was severed by a surgical cyberstrike, it was not just a blackout, it was the sound of a closing trap. The protectors who had sworn to defend the palace were neutralized before they could even draw their weapons, and the man who had been the shield of the state found himself in the middle of a liquidation he could not stop. The story does not reset with the capture. Instead, it plunges into a second, even more desperate crisis that resulted from the first. As Maduro was being bundled into a helicopter in the total darkness of a Caracas morning, a second crisis was already erupting across the country. The removal of the leader did not bring the expected collapse of the regime, but rather a chaotic and dangerous transition. While the Americans celebrated the capture, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was already being sworn in as the interim leader by the Supreme Court. The double in media reses of this moment was the realization that the Americans had captured the king but left the board in the hands of his most ruthless lieutenants. The crisis of the raid led directly to the crisis of a vacuum, where the military and the paramilitary groups began a frantic scramble for the remaining scraps of the state, turning the streets of the capital into a fragmented mosaic of competing loyalties. You can feel the sensory weight of this final act in the cold, salt-sprayed air on the deck of the United States ship Iwo Jima. There is the smell of high-grade jet fuel and the metallic taste of adrenaline that hangs in the back of the throat. Inside the transport cabin, the only sound is the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the rotors and the clinking of steel handcuffs against a metal bench. Describe the visual of the city lights of Caracas disappearing into the distance, replaced by the vast black void of the Caribbean Sea. When Maduro was finally brought into the federal courthouse in Manhattan, the sound of the wooden gavel hitting the bench echoed like a final nail being driven into a coffin. The weight of the world was no longer in the gold bars of the central bank, but in the thick stacks of evidence and indictments that filled the room. Each page, a testament to a world that had been redrawn in the space of a single night. Every solution provided by the capture of the president created a new and more terrifying problem. The Americans had removed a dictator, but in doing so, they had opened a nested loop of international legal and political chaos. By treating a sitting head of state as a common criminal, they had shattered the long-standing norms of sovereign immunity, creating a precedent that terrified leaders across the globe. To secure the country after the raid, the United States was forced to negotiate with the very regime holdovers they had previously sanctioned, effectively propping up the system they had claimed to dismantle. The loop of justice was a loop of compromise, where the removal of one man required the empowerment of a dozen others who were just as dangerous. The solution to the narco-terrorism threat had created a new problem of geopolitical instability that threatened to pull the entire continent into a cycle of retribution. The capture of Maduro has become the ultimate bait for a global audience, fueling a debate that shows no sign of cooling. On one side of the digital divide, voices proclaim that January the 3rd, 2026, was the day that justice finally caught up with a man who had starved his own people. They frame the extraction as a heroic act of liberation, a necessary strike against a criminal enterprise. On the other side, the rhetoric is filled with the language of kidnapping and imperialist aggression. They argue that the Americans have committed the ultimate theft, not just of a leader, but of a nation's right to decide its own fate. They point to the arrival of major American oil companies in the weeks following the raid as proof that the entire operation was a predatory maneuver to seize the world's largest oil reserves under the guise of law enforcement. This collision of perspectives has turned the story into a permanent wound in the international community, a debate where the price of victory is weighed against the cost of a shattered international order. As the sun rose on the first week of Maduro's detention in New York, the map of South America looked the same, but the reality was fundamentally altered. The traitor who had fed Washington every detail was no longer the only ghost in the story. The entire revolutionary project had been reduced to a set of court documents and a series of corporate contracts. The betrayal of the protector was final, and the foreclosure of the state was complete. The nested loop of the Venezuelan tragedy continues to spin, with each new leader promising a return to normalcy, while the fundamental structures of power remain in the hands of those who can pay the highest price. The story of how the United States captured the president is not just a tale of a military raid. It is a document of the modern age, where power is not just about who holds the gun, but who holds the ledger, and where the ultimate cost of survival is the very sovereignty that was supposed to be protected.